my sweet doves, welcome back. So today we're going to be unpacking the Japanese schoolgirl. This was a subject that my patrons on Patreon voted for me to do, so hopefully I do it justice. Anyone who's been watching my videos for a while now probably knows that one of the things I love talking about the most is the intersection between culture and fashion. Something you may not know about me though is that I used to really love anime, especially back in high school. My favorite anime of all time is Hunter x Hunter 2011.
Because I have taste.
And I actually rewatched the entire thing. Well, I started at the beginning of quarantine and it took several months to finish it again because I was watching it with my boyfriend and he's not a binger, so it was a slow grind, but I'd already seen it, so that was okay. But I also had a soft spot for slice of life anime that took place in a high school setting, so Ouran High School Host Club, Sailor Moon, Paradise Kiss. If you haven't seen those, you're missing out. So in general, I'm pretty familiar with the way that the anime industry has portrayed the schoolgirl. Of course, while you'll get pretty wholesome depictions like in the examples I just gave, you also get shows that pander to anime otaku. The word otaku means obsessive fan, and in the anime context, it has a pretty heavy negative connotation, generally associated with body pillow hugging neckbeards who live in dark basements and have pedophilic tendencies. You know.
Incels.
Anime otaku do make up a pretty big chunk of capital though, which is why there are shows out there that pander to their interests. These shows do a lot of zoom shots on boobs and legs and basically employ the male gaze whenever possible.
I am disgusted.
I'm not blaming the anime industry for everything. The film industry is also notorious for portraying young Japanese girls in a very sexualized way, but it actually goes back even further. When girls were first attending school in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were already magazines that depicted these schoolgirls as being sexual and perverse. The Yokohama Daily newspaper published a series called The Tales of Degenerate Schoolgirls, which had 35 installments and lasted between September to November 1905. This series posed as a... Hey, baby. The series posed as a nonfiction account. The series posed as a nonfiction account of late Meiji era schoolgirl life. Of course, the series, as one expects from the title, Degenerate Schoolgirl, was riddled with cautionary tales talking about how schoolgirls would sleep around with schoolboys and get pregnant and drop out of school to become sex workers. Sure, the intentions may have been noble, warning parents to keep a closer eye on their daughters as if they weren't already doing that because it was the 1800s. But the series ultimately also provided racy, perverse subject material for readers, which ended up transforming the schoolgirl into this fetishized caricature similar to the geisha. And it only got worse over time. One of the biggest schoolgirl-related media phenomenons in the last couple decades was compensated dating, which is basically a form of teenage prostitution that became an international scandal in the 90s. For those of you who don't know what compensated dating is, it's basically when schoolgirls would go on dates or hang out with adult men in exchange for money or designer goods.
ね、聞いた？星野さんの噂。何？彼女援助交際してるんだって。嘘。でもなんじゃないの？でも5組のみつ子が渋谷で親父と歩いてるの見たんだって。マジで？
Not all the interactions were sexual, but is it okay for old men to be paying young girls for any kind of service? No. The way that the international media has portrayed the schoolgirl is also quite insidious. Sharon Kinsella, a lecturer in Japanese visual cultures at the University of Manchester, that was a mouthful, theorizes that Europe and North America's obsession with the Japanese schoolgirl stems from pre-existing racist tropes. The more modern trope of the cute and saucy schoolgirl who rebels against the oh-so-oppressive Japanese patriarchy is just a new incarnation of Orientalist storytelling. I also think that the West is so fascinated by the schoolgirl partially on the basis that she just exists. The Japanese media has been hyper aware of the schoolgirl iconography for a long time now, both good and bad depictions. It's important to remember that the United States and literally every country deals with the same kind of messed up issues, including teenage prostitution and sexualizing child stars. Like, no one forgot about Britney Spears' song Hit Me Baby One More Time, right? She recorded the music video when she was 17. But rather than focusing on what is wrong with this country, a lot of Americans instead find joy projecting and pointing fingers at Japan and going off about how messed up Japanese people are. It's only been in recent years that the US's industry treatment of young girls started being interrogated.
I was so excited at 13 when the film was released and my work and my art would have a human response. I excitedly opened my first fan mail to read a rape fantasy that a man had written me. A countdown was started on my local radio show to my 18th birthday, euphemistically the date that I would be legal to sleep with.
But in the 90s, the Japanese schoolgirl was already being talked about, and it's easy to project your own issues onto a concept that already exists. But at the same time that the Japanese schoolgirl is sexualized, she's also presented as a symbol of rebellion in the media. Take movies like Love Exposure, where the protagonist is a violent schoolgirl who likes to smash up happy family homes, and Kill Bill Volume 1, which features the character Gogo Yubari, a 17-year-old Japanese girl in a school uniform who kills people. Now I want to talk about two periods of time when the Japanese schoolgirl style directly led to how the media misinterpreted her. Because guess what? I love fashion and media critique. Let's start with the late 1800s. I choose the late 1800s because it wasn't until 1872 that the Ministry of Education in Japan passed the Education System Ordinance, which was basically a regulation that introduced a new school system based on the American model. And in principle, now all children were supposed to go to school. But because of good old traditions, it wasn't until the late 1890s/early 1910s that more girls started to enroll into schools. The shift happened because the government realized that girls' higher education was actually an asset to the state. For context, the First Sino-Japanese War went on from 1894 to 1895, and men were going to war while wives were keeping up the home front. Girls' higher education was now viewed as a way to foster patriotism and to encourage girls to have more baby boys. So in the government's mind, those boys could become soldiers when they grow up. Early girls' uniforms in the late 1800s took on the look of boys' uniforms, which included hakama, which are these wide-leg trousers. Schoolgirls, known as jogakusei, wore hakama because it was practical. New school buildings followed Western classroom design, so now girls were sitting in chairs at desks, and they wore hakama so that they wouldn't be concerned about flashing people sitting in these new positions. Of course, people were upset because not only were girls participating in school, which is a
Boy thing.
they were also now wearing boys' clothing. And on top of that, schoolgirls also adopted Western shoes, which were only considered to be a masculine accessory at the time. I also want to point out that women who wore Western garments in the 1800s were stereotyped as being lower class or sex workers who only sought after Westerners. It wasn't until 1886 when Empress Shokin declared that all court ladies would be required to wear Western garments for imperial functions. But earlier artworks and stories that depicted schoolgirls used Western clothing to imply the artist's negative opinions about them. In the early 1900s, girls started to wear modified hakama, which had a skirt-like structure instead of a pants-like structure. Shimoda Utako, the founder of the Jisen Women's School, is credited for being the person who redesigned the hakama. This redesign was a compromise because it feminized the uniform a little bit more, but also allowed girls to move freely. I want to emphasize that girls really liked wearing the hakama. Even at schools that didn't require them, girls would still voluntarily wear them or ask permission to wear them. The hakama was viewed as a fashionable garment, and girls could express their own personal styles by knotting the waist cords in different ways. The sailor-style uniform gradually came about in the early 1900s, but really took off in the late 1920s. According to Katsuhiko Sano, the director of the Tombo Uniform Museum, I actually don't know if he's still there, but in 2010 he was there. So according to him, one of the sources for the sailor style uniform was Elizabeth Lee. In 1915, Lee, the American headmistress at the Fukuoka Jogakuen School, which was a Christian girls' school, wore sailor-style clothes. The students loved her outfits so much that a local tailor called Ota's Western Clothing Shop started to reproduce Lee's clothing for the spring 1922 class. This uniform, like the hakama, was initially self-enforced, with a lot of schools not requiring it. Let's fast forward to the 90s because I do really want to talk about Kogaru culture.
Kogaros.
The term Kogaru first showed up in 1993 in the magazine called Spa. Early media usage generally referred to the Kogaru as being sexually deviant teenagers, but over time, as the term became more widely common, the term encompassed girls, teenage girls, who exhibited a certain kind of behavior. I hesitate to call it a style, but I think I will anyway because I'm mostly going to be talking about their clothing. But it's important for you all to know that being a Kogaru meant you behaved in a certain way as well. This included squatting on street corners, like men, using crude language, and posing for pictures with ugly expressions. Also, the style was not universal among all schoolgirls. Sharon Kinsella actually conducted a small survey in 1997 asking students what they thought about the Kogaru, and most of the responses among the participants thought of the Kogaru as pretty rough and uncultured. But let's talk about the Kogaru style. Girls who participated in the style rolled up the waistbands of their school uniform skirts to make them into miniskirts. They wore loose white socks that crumple around their shins, and in the wintertime, they wore Fendi or Burberry check pattern scarves. They also had a lot of cute accessories like Hello Kitty phone cases. They did wear other outfits in the evening and out of school, such as hot pants and slinky dresses, but it's their modified school uniform that really dominated the public's image of them. The school outfits had a very mix-match feel to them. Some students would buy secondhand items from Bloomer Sailor Shops, which were shops that sold pre-worn items to male uniform fetishists. The girls would also swap clothing items with their friends to create an original uniform with different kind of school insignias. Modifying school uniforms was not a new concept. As I said earlier, it started in the 1900s with the girls knotting their waist cords different ways. And then there was a movement of sukuban in the 1970s where some girls joined gangs, wore longer skirts, and cropped their shirts, to name a few examples. But schools always had difficulty with these modified uniforms. Regulations varied depending on the school, of course, but girls who attended stricter schools would have a cuter uniform that they would change into after class. Despite the negative attention that the Kogaru sometimes garnered from the media, they were trendsetters, at least in the street fashion side of the world. Kogaru were featured in magazines like Harper's Bazaar in 2000 and in H, which is a Japanese magazine with an older readership, in 2003. The brand Sock Touch, which kind of faded in relevance in the 80s, became super popular in the 90s because of the Kogaru. Sales rapidly increased in 1993 after the magazine 17 and Puchi Sabun ran stories about Sock Touch as part of Kogaru fashion. Product sales jumped from 10,000 units in 1992 to 4.5 million units in 1994. The reason the socks were popular among Kogaru is difficult to trace. In the early 90s, Eric Smith, founder of the company E.G. Smith, which was a sock-making company, wanted to expand into the Japanese market. He subsequently struck a deal with Wix, a Japanese textile company. The Wix company president, Uehori Takahiro, claims that the loose socks first became popular when they put them in the display at a Sogo department store in Yokohama in 1993. He's quoted saying, "Two high school girls bought the white socks and wore them to class. Before you knew it, the look had caught on at their school." Allegedly. I don't know if he's just saying that to get good company PR. Eric Smith also added that some girls would change into their loose socks in public areas because those socks were against school regulation, so they would change into them after school. And unfortunately, this caused the loose socks to be fetishized by some businessmen. It also didn't help that tabloids that were reporting compensated dating featured these girls wearing loose socks, and then all of this kind of snowballed into loose socks showing up in pornographic films. The sexualization of Kogaru was a real problem, and the media went into a huge frenzy when they were covering compensated dating. Some sociologists actually criticized the media for blowing the situation way out of proportion because apparently there were not that many schoolgirls who were engaging in compensated dating in the first place. Obviously, the fact that any girls were partaking in this is a problem, but the media made it seem like all of them were. To me, the most hellish part of this whole coverage situation is that the media portrayed these girls as being willing participants in compensated dating, which ended up leading cultural producers to viewing these schoolgirls and Kogaru as these post-feminist revolutionary forces. The 1997 film Bounce Kogao, for instance, shows Kogaru in their loose socks arguing and beating up conservative sexist old men. I think it was the combination of the compensated dating scandals and the fact that these girls were so visibly rebelling against their school uniforms that led to them being pigeonholed as these hyper-aware anti-establishment symbols. You may be wondering, so what's the problem? What's the problem with the media depicting these schoolgirls as badasses? Because they are, whether or not they're aware of it. Well, the problem is, once again, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the media is mostly run by adult men, and they paint the schoolgirl the way they want to see her painted. The way this trope has developed actually tells us more about what the writer, the filmmaker, the artist, the journalist wants in our society than it does about real teenage girls. Feminist writer Asano Chie criticized investigative journalists and sociologists under the logic of the same reasoning. For these critics, the sex worker, the high school girl doing compensated dating, or the Tokyo University student who does prostitution are nothing more than tools to further their own political goals. And consequently, these writers have blocked Japanese girls and women from articulating the way that they want to be represented. In theory, teenage girls should be able to just dress up in the way that they want to without carrying the weight of society's expectations for them. Because the reality is, most of these girls weren't thinking of, smashing the patriarchy or sleeping with old men for revenge, which is what male film directors want you to think. I wish there was more media by girls for girls. I wish there was more media where even adult women had the agency to depict their childhoods the way that is realistic to what they actually lived. And I think when male directors depict Japanese schoolgirls in a very revenge-seeking, sexually mature way, it puts the actual girls at risk. There are tons of articles out there, for instance, talking about how girls know what they're getting into when they go on dates with 50-year-old men. So there you go. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into the way that the Japanese schoolgirl is represented in media today. It's just something to think about and something that occasionally gets on my nerves, especially being an Asian woman and seeing all this stuff unfold and feeling so close to it. But yeah, thank you everyone for watching this. I appreciate it, and I'll see you all next time.